The book of Amos in the Old Testament. We'll be there in just a minute. Winter lectureships are always an adventure unless they're in Florida. But when they're in the Midwest, you're never quite sure what you're going to get. I tried to get here yesterday. I got about a quarter mile outside of town and concluded very quickly I was not going to get here. And went back home and I checked. They had travel advisory warnings and there were wrecks everywhere. So I was glad we were able to work out for Kenny to speak last night and for me to speak this evening. It's just a pleasure to be with you. I've not been up in this part of the country probably for 30 years to preach. The first time I was up in this area was 40 years ago, and I got to know the fields. They became dear friends of mine. The kids were just little kids then, not grown adults. And I've known Bill for almost that long, and some of the rest of you we've met over the years, and to be able to come back up here this evening was something I've been looking forward to. And tonight, I want to try to say something from two of the minor prophets. They were minor prophets, but they weren't minor leaguers. Some of the most profound subjects addressed in the Old Testament are tackled by these 12 writers we have at the end of our Old Testament that we refer to as the minor prophets. We're going to start by talking about Amos. Amos was from the town of Tekoa, which was south of Bethlehem, little Bethlehem, about 5-6 miles south of Jerusalem, and then another 5 or 6 miles beyond that was this wide spot in the road known as Tekoa. And to introduce Amos to you, take a look at chapter 7. In Amos chapter 7, the Lord asked Amos, "What do you see?" Amos says, "Well, I see a man holding a plumb line." Now, a plumb line is always a straight line because that's the way the law of gravity works. And the plumb line is held up next to a wall. And the wall is crooked. And the Lord, being a master builder, is not going to tolerate a crooked, out-of-square wall. And so that wall is going to be torn down. That wall represented Israel. And in verse 9 of chapter 7, the word is given, "I will rise with the sword against the house of Jeroboam." Jeroboam II, the king of Israel, the king of their Indian summer, probably the greatest period of prosperity and peace that they had had since the division of the kingdom way back in the days of Rehoboam. But what Israel had been building, what they had been working at, was out of square. It was crooked. And God says, "I'm going to take it down." Amaziah, the priest there in Bethel, that's where they were. Bethel was the Salt Lake City of the religion of the northern kingdom. Amaziah goes to Jeroboam and says, "Amos is here in town bad-mouthing you." And Amos goes back, Amaziah goes back to Amos and says, "Listen, you need to get back down to the Bible Belt and not show your face around here anymore." And Amos says, "I wasn't a prophet. I wasn't the son of a prophet." So we're talking about the not-so-famous Amos tonight, who was the prophet who wasn't the prophet. He was the rustic renegade from the rural region. He says, "I wasn't a prophet or the son of the prophet. I was a farmer, a sheep herder. I had an orchard. I had some trees. And the only reason I'm here is because God told me to come here. He told me what to say. I'm not leaving until it's said." The only place Amos is even mentioned in all the Bible is in his book. There's only one other man, I think, in the entire Bible who has the name Amos, and that's in the genealogy of Mary in the book of Luke, and that's not the Amos we're talking about tonight. So this obscure, rural, non-professional is called by God to go into Bethel, the center of the calf worship up there in the north. And when Israel was at its height of power and prestige, he is to go in and he is to pronounce a message of judgment, a message of doom. Now, to set up the study tonight, turn over to Micah chapter 1, just a few pages toward the end of the Bible from Amos, to Micah chapter 1. verses 2 and verse 3 provide us a thought that we can use when we're talking about those prophets who delivered prophecies of judgment. Micah chapter 1, verse 2. Hear all you peoples, listen, O earth, and all that is in it. Let the Lord God be witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place. He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth. God is going to come down from heaven. When God comes down from heaven, that always results in a crisis on earth. God is more than willing to let men to try to work out their own salvation. I'm not just talking about churchmen. Micah addresses this message here to all of the peoples of the earth. God's willing to let men on earth try to work things out for themselves, but when they can't, when there needs to be a great reset. Have you ever heard that term lately? When there needs to be a great reset, God comes down from heaven and hits the button. And that's what he's doing in the book of Amos. You know, did any of you think we'd ever live to see the situation in this country that we see in this country? I mean, things we thought were nailed down are coming up. I don't even recognize this country in many ways anymore. Things we never thought would happen are happening. The rise of perversity, the rise of irreligion, the rise of hatred, the rise of dictators. I never thought we'd get to this point, but we have gotten to this point. And if you want to know how to live through times like this, you've got to go back to the prophets. Because the prophets talk to people living in times like this. Us growing up in a democracy, we don't realize that we've grown up in an historical bubble. Very few people in the history of the earth have lived in democracies. We've been among those privileged few. And we're in danger of losing that, and that's okay. A democracy is no more godly than a monarchy. It's no more godly than a Caesar government. That's okay with God. He expects us, regardless of the government we live under, to honor the king and to represent him to those around us. But if you want to know how to survive in a godly way in the times in which we live, you've got to go back to the prophets. So that's what we're going to do. And one of the things the prophets tell us is that God rules the world. God just doesn't rule the church. God rules all men. There's one God, there's one world. And the God who made the world is the God who rules the world. David said in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 11, "Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, and the glory. Yours is the kingdom. You are exalted as head above all." Nebuchadnezzar didn't understand that. He thought he was the top dog. And in Daniel chapter 4, God says to Nebuchadnezzar, "Until you know that I rule in the kingdom of men, you're going to be on a high-fiber diet eating grass." And Nebuchadnezzar learned who the true God was. Look at Amos 9, verse 7. Here's an astounding statement that most people have never come across in their study. Amos 9, verse 7. "Are you not like the people of Ethiopia to me, O children of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir?" Now, everybody here who's a Bible student understands that God called Israel out of Egypt into Canaan. But what Amos says, what God says through Amos, is, "I was the one who called the Philistines into Canaan." The Philistines just didn't happen to show up here. I called them into this land. I called the Syrians into Canaan. God was interested in every kingdom. God had plans for every kingdom. And these kingdoms got wrapped up in their politics. They got wrapped up in all their wars and acquisitions of property and oppression and battles and such like. But Acts 17:26 says that it's God who determines the times and the boundaries for every kingdom. If there's a kingdom around today, it's because God determined they be around today, and God has set the limits of their expansion. Do you think it's possible God is at work in Ukraine and Russia right now? Do you think it's possible God is at work in Canada? Do you think it's possible he's at work in communist China? God rules all kingdoms. And I'm going to take you to a verse here in just a minute that gives us some behind-the-scenes insight. But let me tell you what was going on geopolitically in Canaan at this time. The Assyrian Empire under Tiglath-Pileser III began to expand. They pushed east, they pushed west. When they pushed west, they bumped into Syria and then into Israel. And Syria and Israel knew the Assyrians were a huge threat, and so they formed the Western Mid-East Treaty Organization. They joined forces. Often they were at each other's throats, Syria and Israel, but with the threat of Assyria, they joined forces to present a united front against Assyria. They wanted Judah to be part of their alliance, of their treaty organization. Judah didn't want to be involved with them. And so Syria and Israel attacked Judah, trying to force them into their alliance. Now turn to 2 Chronicles 28. I just told you what the headlines would have told you. I just told you what the history books would have told you. But now if you want to know what's really going on, look at 2 Chronicles 28, verse 5. Therefore the Lord his God destroyed him, or delivered him into the hand of the king of Syria. This is talking about Judah, Ahaz. They defeated him, carried away a great multitude of them as captives, brought them to Damascus. Then he was also delivered into the hand of the king of Israel, who defeated him with a great slaughter. The Chronicles fills in some of the details. But the point here is, from a worldly perspective, it looked like this was a political thing going on with Syria, Israel aligning and moving against Judah. God says no. They moved against Judah because I wanted them to move against Judah. I'm trying to get the attention of the king of Judah, Ahaz. I'm trying to bring those people back to acknowledge me as the only Lord. That's what's really going on here. Syria and Israel are the rods of my chastening. That's what's going on here. Turn now to 2 Kings 16, verse 5. Even though God brought Syria and Israel against Judah, God was still in control. And in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 5, then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to make war. And they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. God has every nation on a leash. And no nation can go farther than the leash God has them on. If Russia's in Ukraine tonight, it's not because they're just bigger than Ukraine and have the power to move in. It's because God has given them enough leash, for whatever reason, for them to move in. Syria and Israel got right up to the walls of Jerusalem. I mean, they just rolled in. But they couldn't go a step farther. They're like the dog. You ride by on your bike, and the dog's there in the yard chained to the stake, and it comes snarling and barking at you, and it hits the end of that leash and about chokes itself to death. That's the way God is with people. God had all these nations
on a leash. And then came the day when God did exactly what he said he was going to do in Amos. He brought down judgment, and in 722 BC, the Assyrians deported the Israelites from their land. But I want to show you something. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 24-25. The Assyrians not only moved Israelites out, they moved settlers from Mesopotamia in. Look at verse 24. Then the king of Syria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in the cities. That's where the Samaritans came from. We read about in the New Testament, the Samaritans are the descendants of these Mesopotamian Gentiles brought into the land of Israel after the Israelites are taken out, and they intermarried with some of the Israelites left in the land, and that's where the Samaritan race came from. But now look at verse 25. It was so at the beginning of their dwelling there that they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. God says, I'm moving you into my land. And in my land, you're going to live by my rules. But they didn't know what those rules were. They didn't fear the Lord. They had their own gods they worshiped. God says, all right, I'm going to send some lions in. Any of you see that movie, The Ghost in the Darkness? About the lions there when the British trying to build that railway in Western Africa back in the 19th century. And a couple of lions, the lions are up in the Museum of Natural History right now, by the way, if you didn't know that. A couple of man-eating lions moved in, start grabbing, eating those workers on the railway. I think they ate about 30 of them. And the workers refused to work. And they had to get Michael Douglas and Val Kilmer and send them in to kill the lions before the railroad road could be completed. Well, that's what's going on here. These lions come in. Now, it's very unusual for there to be a pack of lions in Israel. For them to be man-eaters is even more unusual. And these Gentiles brought in, I guess, saw that all as an omen. I mean, this kind of stuff just doesn't happen. We must have upset the God of this land, whom they didn't know. That's exactly what they had done. And they complained to the king of Assyria that the king of Assyria sends an apostate calf priest, an Israelite who was a priest involved in the calf worship. He goes back to Bethel. I'm sure he told him about the God of that land. But I want you to look at verse 33. Talking about these people now who have moved in. They feared the Lord, yet served their own gods. What? They feared the Lord, but served their own gods. They feared the Lord like America is a Christian nation. We put on our coins, in God we trust, but we serve our own gods. These are the lies we tell us. That's the real motto of America. Look at verse 34. They feared not the Lord in the rituals that they did. Oh, they said they feared the Lord. That was the official motto. One nation under God, indivisible, but they didn't fear the Lord. These people who were brought in were willing to acknowledge Jehovah so long as they could do whatever they wanted to do, and that's America. And that's the kind of situation that Amos is talking to. So with all of that said, go back to Amos chapter 1. Look at verse 2. Here's the purpose of the book. The Lord roars from Zion. God sent those lions in after Israel was taken out. God was roaring in Israel before Israel was taken out. Amos chapter 3, verse 8, the lion has roared, who will not fear? I mean, when you're on safari in Africa and you're in your tent there at night and you hear some lion roaring just outside the tent, that's going to send chills up and down your spine. It will scare you to death. When the lion has roared, who will not fear? God had come down from heaven to earth, and he is roaring. There are some commentators who will tell you this word that's translated roar, Amos 1:2, refers to a pouncing lion, to a lion on the attack. And starting with verse 3 through chapter 2, verse 3, 6 nations are mentioned. God's the God of all nations, not just Israel, not just Judah. He gets to Judah and Israel in chapter 2. But before he gets to them, he's going to talk about 6 nations. He's going to talk about the Syrians, Philistines, Phoenicians, Edomites, Ammonites, and Moabites. He is going to pronounce judgment on each of those nations. We're going to look at them in just a minute. These nations were not judged on the basis of the law of Moses. God didn't give them the law of Moses. They were judged on the basis of what Paul calls in Romans 2, the law that's written in the heart. Now take the time to read Romans 2, 14, 15, where Paul talks about the law that God held the Gentiles accountable to. He calls it the law in the heart. The law in the heart referred to that which could be known by human reason. God didn't condemn the Gentiles because they didn't keep the Sabbath. He didn't condemn the Gentiles because they ate ham and bacon. He didn't even condemn them because some of them were polygamists. His condemnation was based on action, behavior that they should have known was wrong just by virtue of their reason. There are 3 ways by which we know what we know. Everything we know falls into one of 3 categories. There are things we know by reason. We're born pre-programmed with some knowledge, right? I mean, did you go to school to learn you can't walk in 2 directions at the same time? You know, there are things we just know because God programmed us that way. There are some things we know on the basis of research. We use our 5 senses: sight, smell, sound, touch, taste, and hearing. We know that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit on the basis of our senses. That's called scientific knowledge or empirical knowledge. And then there are things that we know not because our reason tells us, not because we've done some research and discovered them, but because God's revealed them to us. Revelation. Reason, research, revelation. Only way we know anything. When God condemned Gentiles, it was on the basis of what they should have known was right and wrong based on their reason. They should have known that idolatry was stupid. That's the point Paul makes in Romans 1. They should have known that injustice toward your fellow men is wrong. They should have known that having one standard for the elites and another standard for everybody else. They should have known that elites can commit crimes and never go to jail, but you throw the poor guy over here in jail for jaywalk. They should have known that was wrong. And God condemned them for their immorality, which often descended into what he called abominations. Behavior we can't even begin to imagine. Idolatry, injustice, and immorality were the big 3 things that God condemned the nations for. And let me show you, starting here in verse 3, chapter 1, some specific examples of why the nations were condemned. Now, there are 6 nations. They come in groups of 2. Syria and the Philistines are together. Phoenicia and the Edomites are together. The Ammonites and the Moabites are together. Syria and the Philistines are condemned on the basis of their brutality, their injustice, their inhumanity toward other men. Phoenicians, they are condemned on the basis of their hatred, of their enmity toward their brother. Ammonites, Moabites, condemned on the basis of the atrocities they perpetrated against others. Let's read some verses. Verse 3, chapter 1, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they have threshed Gilead with implements of iron. Now, there's a right way to kill a man, and there's a wrong way to kill a man. If you want to line a man up against a wall and shoot him, that's one thing. You don't run him through a combine. They thresh Gilead with implements of iron. One of the last rebellions in the history of England was in the 17th century, around 1685, and there was a 70-year-old widow who was condemned to death because she took some part in the rebellion. She was condemned to be burned at the stake. She appealed to the king for mercy, and the king showed her mercy. He allowed her to be beheaded. Now that's merciful. That's how Roman citizens were killed, because it was quick, painless, I guess. But burning at the stake, they not only killed people, they tried to make it as horrendous as possible. Drop down here, let me find my verse, to verse 6. In verse 6, Gaza, the Philistines. Damascus is Syria. Gaza is the Philistines. For 3 transgressions of Gaza, for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they took captive the whole captivity to deliver them up to Edom. They deported entire populations into slavery. I read just the other day, or I heard the other day, a guy saying, if the Confederates had never fired on Fort Sumter, if they would have just continued playing brinkmanship, the North probably would have gotten tired of that, and they could have kept their slavery. I wonder if God was behind the firing on Fort Sumter. I wonder if God was so tired of the degradation involved in human slavery that God wanted an end brought to it, and he came down from heaven and he saw that first shot was fired. Syrians and Philistines were involved in horrible brutality against their fellow man. Now look at Phoenicia and Edom. In fact, in this next section here, we've got a particularly despicable situation, because Phoenicia and Edom violated the brotherly covenant. In verse 9, for 3 transgressions, Tyre, for 4, I'll not turn away its punishment, because they delivered up the whole captivity of Edom and did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. I mean, the Philistines are taking captives of people they're not related to. The quantity of their captivity was what God found horrendous. But with the Phoenicians, the quality of their acts, it was brothers they were turning over as captives. It was Joseph and his brothers kind of a thing that they were engaged in, selling their brother into slavery. The bonds of that familial relationship of being a brother to someone had no effect. If they could make a buck off their brother, they'd make a buck off of him. Come down to verse 11. For 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because he pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all pity. His anger tore perpetually. How angry do you have to be to try to impeach a president when he's no longer president? How angry do you have to be where you hound someone into the grave? And that against your brother. How angry does a Cain have to be to kill an Abel? The enmity expressed between brothers. Men should have known, no matter where they came from, New Guinea, the Aborigines of Australia, no matter where they come from, that brothers are to have a special bond. And you don't sell them into slavery to make a buck. And you don't get angry and maintain that anger so that it's said of you it's an unquenchable fire, burning perpetually. And then come down to Ammon and the Moabites. Look at verse 13. For 3 transgressions of the people of Ammon, for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they ripped open the women with child in Gilead, that they might enlarge their territory. The atrocities, the barbarities done in war, the Crusaders, when they got to Jerusalem the first time, those Christian men would grab those little Arab children, take them by the leg, and slam their head against a wall, saying, God wills. Ripping open pregnant women just to acquire more territory. Look at verse 1, chapter 2. For 3 transgressions of Moab, and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime. The king was already dead. That wasn't good enough. They burned his bones down to the chemical elements. John Wycliffe, who did so much to bring the Bible to the common tongue, to the vernacular, the great Bible translator John Wycliffe, after he died, he was declared by the church to be a heretic. They dug up his body and burned his bones into lime. Now, you know why God singles out these nations, talks about their crimes, and tells why he's going to do what he's going to do? It's because it doesn't help us to love it doesn't help us to hate what God hates if we don't love what he loves. And he loves men. And when we don't love the man made in his image, when we can do to a fellow, whether our brother, neighbor, or enemy, what these nations were doing, God takes note of that. And he doesn't wink at it. That passage in, Acts 17:30, in times past, God winked at the ignorant. That doesn't mean he was excusing them. He was not excusing them for what they should have known. They should have known that hating a brother, they should have known that hurting a neighbor, they should have known that brutally treating an enemy was wrong. We say we love God, hate our brother. We don't love God, John says. And throughout the book of Amos, he goes through sin after sin, crime after crime, primarily of Israel. Woe to those who are at ease in Zion. And the lion has roared, and judgment is coming, and it wasn't but a generation after Amos was gone that the judgment fell. The only bright spot in this entire book is right, I think, at the very start and at the very end. At the very start, for 3 transgressions, yea, for 4. 4 strikes and you're out. Now that speaks to me of grace. And that speaks to me of long-suffering. That speaks to me of patience. God gave these nations every opportunity to get their act together, and they didn't. And then at the very end of the book, Amos chapter 9, look at verse 11. On that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord who does this thing. That's a great prophecy. It's quoted in the book of Acts. He's going to bring back the captives of his people Israel. They'll build the waste cities. They'll plant vineyards, drink wine from them. They'll make gardens, eat fruit from them, plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. God's going to bring Israel back. If they would turn to him and worship him, he's going to restore them to the blessings they once enjoyed. So let me close now by saying again, thank you for your patience tonight. Let me close by saying, you want to know what God thinks about what's going on now in this country, you read the book of Amos. And just about every sin that we see around us is laid out in Amos. And God expresses his opinion. I really hope there is enough salt left in America that we can continue a while longer. In the days of Elijah, there were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal, and despite the fact Ahab was as bad as it got. I mean, the Bible tells us he was the champion sinner among the kings of Israel. There were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to his God, and the nation continued a while longer, but it got to the point where there was no longer 7,000. I hope we've got 7,000. I hope we've got people who are shining salt. And because of that, God will bless us with some more time in this country. Thank you so much for your attention for this study in Amos.